Hello and welcome. Today is our first session for the online Forest Summit, BC Forests of Peoples Convergence. And we've got an exciting session today. We're here with Rachel Holt, Martin Carver, Jens Wieting, and Stan Swinarchuk. I'm Jennifer Houghton and I'm one of the co-organizers for the summit. We're just going to launch right into it. Rachel's going to talk about old growth, Jens is going to talk about climate change, Martin's going to talk about hydrology, and Stan's going to talk about his experiences with wildlife. We've got a lot of content to cover today, and these experts who could talk for a very long time on their particular subjects have agreed to summarize as best they can. So thanks, you guys. We could probably have a forestry summit that would last for about a month in order to cover all of this great content. I'm going to introduce Rachel Holt. Dr. Rachel Holt is a professional biologist who's worked as an independent consultant based in Nelson for the last 20 years. She works on a variety of issues which have often revolved around how to better manage the public forest to maintain ecological, societal, and cultural values, with clients including the province of BC, forest companies, First Nations, and environmental groups. She's been co-chair of the Forest Practices Board as well. Rachel recently wrote a report called BC's Old Growth Forest, A Last Stand for Biodiversity, and her co-authors were Karen Price and Dave Doust. I'm going to put a link to where the full report is available on her website at viridianecological.ca. I'll put a link to that. Rachel, Karen, and Dave wrote this report under their own steam after each of them worked in old forest management issues in BC for more than 20 years. And they saw a long-standing gap in publicly available analysis and were moved to start to fill in that gap, particularly in order to help inform the provincial old growth panel. So thank you so much for your work, Rachel. I'm going to let you launch right into it.
All right, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, everyone. So I was asked to talk about the effect of forestry on old growth, and as you just heard, this is a bit of a summary of a recent report that we just wrote. So, and nothing I'm going to say here is in the slightest bit surprising. So the basic tenet of modern forestry is to take a natural forest with its overmature, decadent trees and to normalize it so that it becomes even age. And the idea is to get rid of all the old forest. That is the fundamental premise of forest management. You don't want to have, if you're a forester, any trees that are inefficiently wasting growing potential by being old. You want to cut those trees at the maximum rate of growth, and you want to switch them over to new vigorous trees. That is forest management in a nutshell, and I kind of could stop right there because that's what we do in British Columbia. But I'll keep going. So BC is one of the few places left in the temperate world that we haven't already done this. We haven't already converted our forests. And in that sense, it's globally unique here. But we're also well on track along that path. You know, 100 years ago, often now when I drive into Vancouver, I think about what the estuary used to look like. The Fraser Estuary, one of the largest estuaries in North America. It would have been stupendous. Think about that next time you drive around in Vancouver. So it started there and continued southern Vancouver Island, and then ramped up, you know, we're talking a couple of hundred years ago there, they ramped up in the interior in the 70s and 80s and logging at full steam to convert the forests. The war in the woods in the 1980s highlighted attention on this, and the NDP government at the time stopped and said, okay, yes, we need to do something different. So they initiated protected areas and a biodiversity strategy. And they identified that managing old growth was key to maintain biodiversity going forward. So then, okay, we're all supposed to relax. We've done that. The world is going to be fine. Every government since then, all governments, there's only been two, sadly, perpetually say that there's lots of old growth left. And in fact, they often say that the amount of old growth is increasing. So my colleagues, Karen Price and Dave Doust, and I were just tired of hearing this and decided to do our own analysis. So we took publicly available inventory data on forestry and categorized the amount of old growth remaining in the province, compared it to how much naturally should be there, expected to be there naturally. And we split that into biogeoclimatic units, the broad ecosystem types, and also landscape units, which is how we manage our forests. And we added a third category. We added productivity, site productivity to the analysis. Site productivity says if you have a not very productive site, you're going to grow a small tree, no matter how long you wait. If you have a very productive site, you can grow a big tree quickly. And we use that scale, site index, to break down how different types of ecosystems in the province, because these things are visibly different, they're biologically different, they're functionally different, and that's a really important thing to do if you want to know how much of something there is. You need to not combine things that are really different and add them all up. So we did this analysis. I could talk about the results for a long time, but I will just summarize them very quickly. So there's some numbers here. The province of BC is 90 million hectares. And about half of it, 50 million hectares, is forested. So the rest of it is alpine, rock, water. Of that, about 13.3 million hectares is old growth. And we agree with the province. We have the same number as them. It technically is old forest. It's been there for a long time. But when we break it down further and we start to look at the productive forest, of the 90 million, only about 415,000 hectares, that's 0.4% of the province, has the potential to grow big trees, have a site index greater than 20. And only about 35,000 hectares, so that's less than 0.01% of the province, can grow the biggest trees greater than 25 site index. So this is what's left. And although we don't expect all forests to be old naturally, you know, there's lots of natural disturbances out there that reset the forest. Over 85% of the productive forests in BC have less than 30% of the natural amount of old. That's a bit complicated. But so the vast majority, more than 85% of the productive forests, the ones that actually grow trees of a reasonable size, like that's this big and bigger, have less than 30% of the natural expected amount left of old. And nearly half of those combinations have less than 1% of the amount expected naturally. This current status, that's what is there today. This puts biodiversity, ecological integrity, resilience all at high risk. And we're not done yet. So the plan is the current policy lets you harvest the vast majority of what's left. And so remember that we put in place this policy that was supposed to protect all this forest. We have a current status today that is very poor. We are going to a place, if we complete the current policy, to a much worse state. So what happened to that policy? Why does it fail? Well, it fails for a number of reasons. It fails because we designed it to fail. So let's just cut to that chase. We designed it so that it preferentially protected the non-productive land base. So for instance, of the 23 million hectares of protected areas, more than half of it is not forested, which is fine. Alpine is good. All ecosystems are equally good, but they're really different, and you need to protect them all in a representative manner. Of that, about 80% of the actual protected areas in British Columbia have site index less than 15. So that means they are capable of growing a tree that's just about merchantable, that you would just about log. The cutoff is different in different parts of the province, but in lots of places, they don't log things that are less than 12 as a site index. So ballpark there, about 80% of the protected areas don't have trees in them that anybody would ever want to log from a historical perspective of merchantable timber. And the other thing that we put in place was old growth management areas, and provincially, looking at the provincial legal OGMA map, only about a third of those specific areas that are specifically designated to maintain old growth, only about a third of them are actually old forest today. So we're not protecting the old in the OGMAs, and we're not protecting the old in the protected areas. One of the things that happens is that we co-locate all these things, which maybe I can come back to in the questions, but that's one of the issues that happens, is that we focus our protected areas on little places that we don't want to harvest. And that has been an actual specific part of the policy. Put your old forest protection in the non-contributing land base, in the places that we're not going to harvest. And then you can overlap it with other things that you're not going to harvest. And so as a result of that, you know, it's not a bad place to start in terms of thinking about trying to minimize your impact on timber supply. But if you don't do the other side of the coin, which is specifically protect the places that you do need to protect, i.e. those big productive stands that are left that are globally unique, then you won't ever protect them. And this has been a fundamental failure in the system. So we wrote this report, all the numbers are there in that. We made some recommendations. We need to stop logging the endangered old growth forest. We really do. There are many places in the province where the amount of real old growth remaining is, and when I say real, I'm talking about the stuff that you would think of, that the public thinks of when the province says it's protecting old forest. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that the other old forest isn't important. It's equally important, but we have to keep the range, and we have to maintain the biodiversity in the places that have highest biodiversity, which is usually large structural stands that have big trees, lots of different niches that keep the water cool, that maintain a lot of carbon that you're just about to hear about. Those things, we're not doing that today. So we have to stop that. And I work in a lot of projects that have multi-party participation, and we're also interested in jobs, but we're coming to the bottom of that curve with or without protecting old forest. We are going to transition the industry. In some places, we're already doing it. We're seeing mills close because of I won't start down that path because I don't have time. But we are already transitioning the industry in much of BC. We are going to transition the industry in the rest of the places where there's just a little bit left, and we're not doing it fast enough. So these jobs will end. It would be really great to transition the industry in a thoughtful, careful way that moved towards creating many more jobs, which we have thoroughly failed to do in this province over the last 40 years, although it's been called for time and time again. Now we're at the bottom of the curve, and it's deeply concerning, both from an ecological perspective and a community resilience perspective. So we need to stop that. We need to implement real science-based policies. We need to transition to second growth forestry. And we need to transition to non-old growth forestry. So there's quite a lot of forest that is not old, but is still primary forest. And the policies that we have, what we actually need to do is implement them properly. So that is my place of the most egregious failure, really. We say we're doing a whole bunch of protection, which we're not doing. And anybody who knows the ins and outs of these things knows this. Everybody knows it. We don't do anything about it. We need to take that on. If we want to let biodiversity go, then let's just say so and have that happen. But let's not tell the public or First Nations or anyone else that we're doing something when we're not doing it. I will stop there. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a really understandable summary of some complicated work, and the link to your entire report will be shared so people can take a look at the details. All right, thank you so much. Let's move over to Jens, who's going to link the thread here with some talk about climate change and carbon.
Jens is the Senior Forest and Climate Campaigner with Sierra Club BC, and he works on protecting BC's spectacular rainforests and fighting global warming. His primary focus is solutions to maintain the ecological integrity and the climate stabilizing role of BC's globally rare temperate rainforests, all the way from Vancouver Island to the Great Bear Rainforest. Jens is following climate science and advocates for strong climate action to phase out fossil fuels and speed up the transition to zero emissions. Jens grew up in West Germany and spent time in the Amazon rainforest between high school and university, and he got hooked on rainforests and concerned about their fate.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks Jennifer for organizing this. I'm in East Vancouver. I'm joining you from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh, and I have a few slides for you to talk about forests and climate, which is obviously a very heavy, complicated topic, and part of why this is so challenging is that we are in an emergency. And I have a photo here from visiting an old growth forest with a yellow cedar older than 1,000 years in a cut block proposed by BC Timber Sales. And the reason why I'm including this photo is that when we talk about forests and climate, we have to talk about our flaw to grasp the urgency to address these emergencies. So this discussion we are having today must be understood in the context of how rapidly we are changing the climate. And this is a graph that many of you probably have seen, showing that we had the very comfortable situation here that we lived with a relatively stable climate for about 10,000 years on this planet. And we are now at this point where we have already warmed the planet by more than 1 degree. And one reason why we are not seeing the leadership that we need to address this emergency is our flawed sense of time, our change blindness. And this is true for both the climate emergency and the ecological emergency. We have a very similar rapid shift here, both looking at climate and looking at our landscapes. We have transformed the planet, the atmosphere, and we have transformed landscapes here in British Columbia in just about 100 years of industrial activity, burning fossil fuels, clear-cutting forests. And this is not going to end well unless we force the leadership to address this crisis. One way we have in this part of the world to understand the urgency is to remind ourselves that Indigenous peoples have lived on these territories for a similar amount of time, 10,000 and more years, with a relatively stable climate, without undermining intact ecosystems. And again, just about 100 years, a little bit more than 100 years of industrial activity, we have brought the climate and ecosystems close to breakdown. So we cannot save a stable climate without intact forests, and we cannot save intact forests without a stable climate. We are running out of time to save both, and 3 reasons. One is forests are currently still helping us to slow down climate change. So this has already changed in British Columbia, but globally, forests continue to sequester a lot of carbon, and that way avoiding even worse climate change. And we cannot afford to lose this, and we have to do our part in this part of the world to avoid losing this service. And they are still protecting communities from climate impacts. Without intact forests, impacts like flooding, droughts and fires would be even worse. And we absolutely need strong climate action, including protection and restoring forests. This is what's happening here in BC. So here in BC, our forests are no longer a carbon sink. So very roughly speaking, you can see here how 10, 15 years ago, BC's forests were still a carbon sink. That's why there's a part in blue showing that they absorbed more carbon compared to what was lost. And you can also see how this changed in the early 2000s. And we have in yellow here the ongoing carbon loss from logging, essentially. And we have a little bit of orange showing that we lose millions of tons of carbon because of slash burning. And you can see how wildfires are getting worse and making this situation really dramatic. And the blue is showing how our forests absorbing some carbon, and then the blue disappears in the last 10 years because the carbon losses are becoming so big that they make it impossible, at least in this visual, to see how the reduced ability of our forests to sequester at least some carbon is essentially overwhelmed. And of course, wildfires are to a certain degree beyond our control, but it's very important to note that there's more and more research showing that industrial logging and industrial forest management is making these fires worse. This is one example, a paper from Australia shared in July. And here in BC, these emissions are now way higher than all our combined official emissions. Unfortunately, forest emissions are not counted, which leads to ignoring them. But if we would actually add up those emissions that are officially counted from transportation, use of energy and so on, burning fossil fuels, and forest emissions, today about 78% of our overall carbon footprint is related to the losses from our forests. One example, as I mentioned, is slash burning, and this is a low-hanging fruit. We just can't allow this to happen. And here's the other reason, climate risks. So you can easily find the provincial climate risk assessment. We have a list of about 15 climate impacts. Some of them will likely become catastrophic by mid-century unless we act to slow down climate change. And about 8 or 9 of them are absolutely related to the question of what forests will we have today in the coming decades. And from wildfire to water shortages to flooding, ecosystem integrity, there are many things we can still do by drastically reforming forest management to mitigate or reduce the danger of some of these impacts, but time is running out. So the assessment of these risks exists, but it's not discussing forest management, which is a severe shortcoming and another example of lack of leadership, because we absolutely need to take a closer look. How can we address at least some of these risks by changing forest management? So in short, we cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis, but we are not seeing this. You can see a lot more information about this in this report. It's called Clear Cut Carbon. We took a look at 13 years of logging in BC, 2005 to 2017, and found that overall the amount of logging added up to 3.6 million hectares, which is more than the entire area of Vancouver Island. A little bit more of old growth, a little less second growth logged in these 13 years. All of these logged areas are sequestration dead for more than 10 years because young trees actually need quite a bit of time before they start to sequester a significant amount of carbon compared to the ongoing massive losses after a clear cut. So we are in the midst of an emergency, but our government continues to consult. Many of you are waiting for the old growth panel report, and we are still not certain whether we will see any meaningful action, which we absolutely need because we are running out of time. So we have spectacular opportunities in this part of the world to contribute to solutions. We have in some of BC's forests, very high carbon storage per hectare. We have some of the highest trees on the planet in this part of the world. And we belong to the small group of countries and regions in the world that are home to some of the last intact temperate rainforests, a very globally rare ecosystem. So we have very different ecosystems. Some of them are already impacted by climate change, and we have to accept that transition is underway. But as Rachel pointed out in this report, we also have ecosystems that are relatively resilient, mostly old growth forests, and we absolutely have to work harder to protect as many of these relatively resilient ecosystems as quickly as possible. And we have to help to ensure that we have some resistance and some support in those areas where transition is already underway. But we really need a dramatic reform. So in short, we have to protect and restore forests to ensure that we keep more carbon in the forests. We can do this through forestry law reform. We can do this through modern land use plans, and we need new land use designations respecting indigenous rights. We need restored government capacity to actually restore forest stewardship, which we essentially don't have anymore in this province. It has been reduced more than 10, 15 years ago, became almost unrecognizable after thousands of jobs disappeared. We have to rebuild this because we actually need these environmental services. And we have to support communities and businesses that actually want to improve forest management and raw log exports, invest in value-added wood products, creating more jobs and less damage per cubic meter of wood. So we are in an emergency. We have about 10 years to reach reduce emissions by half, and we have a unique opportunity in this part of the world to contribute to global solutions. And just a reminder, as we see these terrible fires in California, that some of the ancient redwoods have survived the fire in a big basin, for example. This is an incredibly important wake-up call for our governments to act, to make sure that we protect as many of the remaining old growth forests and intact forests to ensure that we have at least some of these environmental services for our children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jens. Excellent information. Let's go over to Martin Carver, who is going to talk to us about hydrology.
Martin Carver is a hydrologist and a fluvial geomorphologist with 25 years experience in water resources, emphasizing land use, conservation, and risk assessment. His work focuses on forestry and various other sectors in the Columbia, Peace, Athabasca, and Liard River systems. He is co-author of the 2019 Watershed Assessment Guideline, jointly published by Engineers and Geoscientists BC and the Association of BC Forest Professionals. He is co-author of the Water Quality Procedure applied across the province under the Forest and Range Evaluation Program. He authored a 2017 report for the Columbia Basin Trust, assembling the state of water science and water monitoring in the Columbia Basin in relation to climate change. He works across Western Canada as an independent consultant based in Nelson.
I decided to give it a little bit of background so that Jennifer is interested in people having a bit of an understanding about the impacts of forestry, modern forestry here in BC on water would be satisfied. And then I wanted to add a few points about some contemporary issues. And further, I thought I would just start right off by saying my main 3 points, sort of take-home messages. And when I say forestry, I'm talking about kind of conventional clear-cut harvest. So I'm going to say my main 3 points at the front end. And the first is that although soil and water move around naturally on a landscape, forestry activities accelerate these rates. And that leads to some concerns for communities and ecosystems. And the outcomes of that acceleration are now largely publicly unavailable under our privatized system of forest management. The second point is that forestry, as it's practiced, disregards the value of water of old forests, the value of old forests to water And lastly, forestry's hydrologic effects are becoming more and more severe as the climate changes. So let me just give a bit of background each of those three areas. The first one then, just general impacts from forestry. There are many effects from forestry, many hydrologic effects, but the two large groups of effects concern kind of sedimentation and changes to the flow regime. I just want to go through a bit of a forest hydrology 101. Sedimentation then, we live in a mountainous province, steep hillsides and channels, and is a tremendously active geomorphic environment. Just 10,000 years ago, glaciers were all over the place, turned up the landscape, mobilized sediment at various sizes, and forests have stabilized that landscape. Forests have put that material in place and kept it from moving. But now with forestry, we dig up the ground with roads, we concentrate and redirect water, we cause surface erosion and landsliding, and so this material is remobilized. And changes to the flow regime also cause that to happen. So this is one great area of effect from forestry activities is sedimentation. But changes to the flow regime is the other area too. And that's a little more complex to describe, and I'll just hit the high points today. But forests essentially determine how much water or snow enters a watershed, how it melts, and how it runs off and reaches the outlet. So there's many changes that can happen, but we have to remember that BC has both nival and pluvial systems, that's rain-dominated and snow-dominated systems. And if we just look at snow-dominated for a moment, forests intercept snow and cause it to sublimate, which is kind of like evaporation. So it actually reduces the amount of water that is in the watershed. And clearings melt snow faster, and roads evacuate water faster. So many of the changes with forestry cause the acceleration, if you like, of the forest, the flow regime. And this leads to these very common changes: higher peak flows, earlier peak flows, and lower low flows, particularly when young stands are growing vigorously. So those are just two of the great areas of hydrologic impact from forestry that I wanted to introduce. But put simply, forests minimize sedimentation and they moderate flow regimes. These are two of the great values of forests. And forests in BC and forestry as it's practiced, one of its notable characteristics that distinguishes it from other land uses is how widespread forestry is. It's across all parts of the province. And so these effects are occurring all over. And now under the Forest Practices Code in the late 1990s, everything essentially was public, no, I wouldn't say everything, but most was publicly available. But now under the present regulatory regime, that's changed. And the public doesn't have access or a strong ability to monitor and understand how things are changing, how hydrology is changing under forestry. So you could say this is like the evil twin of the basic effects on hydrology, is that the information that the public needs to reach its own conclusions is largely unavailable. So that's my hydrology, Forest Hydrology 101 primer on the current state of hydrology with respect to forestry. Now the second area is about old forests, and I'm going to build on what Rachel has introduced here and a little bit what Jens introduced, that the value of primary forest to water is largely disregarded in conventional forestry. Rachel said it plainly, old forests are actually at odds with the principles of modern forestry of maximizing fiber and timber production, which creates younger second growth stands. But yet those old forests have great abilities at providing clean water in the amount that we need it and in the timing we need it, that classic water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. I'll just introduce a couple of points about how they do that. This will be familiar, I'm sure, to you, that I mentioned that the canopy intercepting snowfall and causing it to sublimate. Roots keep soils in place on steep ground. Old forests protect streams and stream banks and stop them from destabilizing. Intact soil profiles retain water and impact subsurface pathways. They're a natural filtration system, and they're even better able to withstand wildfire. But unfortunately, those old forests, which have all these great properties in relation to water, have been extensively removed all over the province, and they continue to be removed. So that would be my second point I'd like to make. And the third one then, in the last couple of minutes that I have, is concerning climate change. Now, many of the changes brought about by climate change are unfortunately the same changes that clear-cut forestry brings about. It's really too bad that they are very similar, but when you have them together, they result in more severe outcomes, and particularly when the level of road building and harvest is significant, as it's become in many basins across the province. So you know that with climate disruption, we're seeing increased drought, increased flooding, and wildfire. And in forested watersheds, the typical outcome of that would be higher peak flows, earlier peak flows, the changes that I've mentioned before. But when these two work together, they superimpose, and they actually work non-linearly to yield rather significant outcomes with escalating magnitude. This amplification of the effects of forestry is a very unfortunate outcome of having this change in climate amidst our activities. We can think about Grand Forks, where I think Jennifer lives, as an example. Now, those are my 3 points I wanted to make. That effects on sediment and the flow regime of forest management, clear-cut forest management, is significant, and the ability to evaluate it is largely unavailable to the public. There's tremendous value of old forests in forest hydrology, and then the effects of forestry are actually amplified by our changing climate. So in conclusion, where does this take us? Because pretty significant changes are happening all over the province. I'd say we're backed into a corner now hydrologically. We really are. We're on track for some very significant consequences, even if we halt our activities right away. And what is needed is an array of initiatives, from widespread restoration on a vast scale in the province, a sharp reduction in harvest levels, including retention and protection of old forests, whatever is remaining, and a large and immediate decline, obviously, in greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was a really, really clear to understand summary. I appreciate the way that you've linked together these topics as well. So we're going to head over to Stan.
Stan Swinarchuk is a retired logger and a hunter and fisherman who lives here in Grand Forks in the Boundary watershed, and he has been observing conditions in our watershed for over 60 years.
I came to Grand Forks in 1960, and I was living in a foster home, and happened to be the foster home was a guy that had a logging outfit, and hence during the summer holidays I would be out in the forest with these guys, with some of these old timers. So a lot of these people taught me a hell of a lot about how to look after the forest. An example. So I'm setting chokers behind a little D6 cat, and I hooked a choker on the wrong side of this particular tree, and this old George, he would sit there and yell at me, "Stan, what the hell are you doing?" What, George? "When I pull this tree in, I'm going to knock that little sapling down." Now it's, 3 or 4 inch, maybe 5 inch, and that's how I learned. These people actually cared about the forest and the little ones that are there when you're logging. Of course, this was a selective logging show. That's what we were doing. And anyway, so I learned a lot from there, and then I just became a faller. And I worked on machines too, and I became a faller, and that's a real foot on the ground, if you can understand. Bunchers is not a foot on the ground. That's a massive site degradation situation.
So can you tell us, Dan, about what you've seen changes in wildlife populations? Like
Yeah.
you told me a story of how you and your brother were fishing up at Boulder Creek when you were teens, and
Yeah.
what have you seen changes in the fish populations in our watershed?
Yeah. Well, this is all climate change. This is all old growth. This is all hydrology. In 2015, we're going to Kelowna with my wife, and I'm driving along the West Kettle River, and I looked down, and the West Kettle was bone dry. Never seen that in my life before, and I've been here since 1960. And this is 2016. Holy shit! Look at this. No water. There was water, but further down. So, and it's running underground. And you, hydrology person, says that, or that water actually eats carbon. Well, does it eat it when it's underneath all those rocks? I guess maybe not. But in 2015, that's the first time I've ever seen it like that. Anyway, the wildlife situation. Oh, just a little story. Can I tell you this? I was out Monday. I went up to the top end of the Kettle River watershed, and lo and behold, and I have not seen this for 20 years, I saw a stinking porcupine up at the top end of the Kettle, well, it was Rendell Creek area, and I'm thinking, wow, it's been 20 years since I've seen a porcupine. The porcupines have probably extinct in this part of the country that we're in. Never seen one for 20 years. Prior to that, I've seen lots of them. Anyway, that's a little bit of wildlife story. And I was also up there. I put on 510 kilometers on Monday, and I got home at roughly 11:15 in the evening. And I started at 7 a.m. So I put on 510 kilometers, and I saw the porcupine. The grouse seem to be a little bit better up there, still not nowhere near they should be population-wise. The deer I counted, in that, I was out there, 12, 14, 16 hours. I saw roughly about 8 or 9 deer, and a lot of them with does with fawns, right? So I used to see, going up to work, just a short distance, I used to see 20, 30 within 40 kilometer stretch. Now you're lucky to see one. I can go out there I do go out there a lot of times, and I see wildlife, none. Maybe a squirrel, maybe a chicken, grouse. And that's it. No deer, no bear, no nothing. They're going extinct. All the mule deer population is probably down by 80%. The bear population is down roughly by 60%. The chickens, they got to be down about 80%, 80 or 90% in our watershed.
What about the fish?
Fish, and also 2015 is the year that I saw hundreds of fish down below Grand Forks along the Gilpin shores, belly up, all dead, hundreds of them. Anyway, I go down there fishing, and I'm looking, holy shit, I mean, there's dead fish all over the place. And and there's a couple of people that knew it, that I know, but you never heard it in the newspaper or nothing. That's a massive thing. Fish die off. And now that they're logging clear cut, the fish are in danger, the wildlife is in danger, the climate change is in danger, you and I are in danger, my grandchildren are in danger. That's why I'm here today.
What are you seeing in terms of changes to wildlife food supply?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, the food supply, that's that old man's beard, especially with caribou. I mean, they lived on that, that falls from the trees, especially the old growth trees. And they're extinct in our area now, too. And also mule deer. Mule deer eat almost the same things that caribou do. And they're getting emaciated, you know, they don't look well. They're looking, when you do see one, he's not well, or she's not well, you know. The bears, they got no berries anymore, because these guys, when they're dragging the logs across the forest, of course, you know, it kills all the shrubs, hence huckleberries, blueberries. So these bears are coming out of their dens, and some of the cubs are dying right in the dens, because the mother hadn't got enough food and fat to last the winter and feed the two, whether she's got two or one, it doesn't matter, but it can't feed them. And I've seen one coming out of the den, well, not out of the den, she was already on the slope looking around, and she just looked emaciated, you know. She was, her hair was hanging, she wasn't good looking, and she had two cubs with her. Mm-hmm.
How do you think we should be logging differently in order to protect that habitat, the berries that you were talking about, for example?
One simple way. Decrease the, I'm not talking about the AAC, you can have that, but decrease the size of the blocks that you're logging, because then the AAC will have to be decreased on its own, right? So decrease those blocks. We don't want to see even 40 hectare blocks, too big. Take it down to 20, that's 40 acres on the old side. Take 20 hectares, and then you have to leave a 20 hectare block all the way around that, far away, not back to back. You know what you're doing. So you're just creating another 40 hectare block if you put 20 to 20 together, right? So you have to leave 20 and 40 and 50, and then pretty soon the forest will start growing. Other elements of the ecosystem will start to heal. You know, they'll start to heal.
All right, thank you so much, Stan. That was some really great information about local wildlife. I'm going to go back to our speakers and ask them to talk a little bit about opportunity and potential and possibilities and the directions that they think we should be going. We've discussed a lot of the problems, great summary. We've tied the threads together. So let's start with Rachel. Where do you think the possibility and potential lies? What are some solutions that we should be looking at?
Right. Well, I think the hopeful lens on it is that we do know what to do. We, in all the time that I've worked in BC and for a long time before that, we know that it's not a good idea to push ecological systems very far outside their natural range for all the reasons that we just heard, for biodiversity reasons, for water reasons. I mean, it is phenomenal how we are managing to live in a bubble and pretend like all of this is not happening. I think the hope part is that COVID has made a lot of people think about what the opportunities are. And we've stopped for a moment frantically running from place to place. And I see it everywhere. I see every conversation being about, okay, we knew this was crazy. We have an opportunity to change the plan. And this is global. It's much bigger than these relatively small issues. Our local issues that we've been individually concerned about for a long time. It's really about a fundamental value shift that I don't hear from anybody that they don't want that to happen. And the key thing, I think, for people is to understand that they do have a voice and that they must raise their voice. Because unfortunately, our politicians are currently gambling about whether to save old forest or whether to look like they're saving jobs in the short term, because they're hearing a lot of pressure from people whose jobs today are potentially on the line. They are not thinking about the bigger picture at all. They are trying to weigh how to win the next election. So we, the people who do care about the long-term future, the long-term climate, we have to raise our voices, and we're seeing kids doing it. We're seeing Greta Thunberg doing it. We're seeing a lot of kids really frightened about their future, and we should be all terrified. And so the only thing that we have to do is to raise our voices. And this is not a sideline little group of people. It's not some crazy bunch of lunatics in the forest. It is real people with real genuine concerns, and we have to say so. You middle-aged folk out there who don't normally stick your hand up, you need to start sticking your hand up and saying this matters to you. Across the board, across the political spectrum. It's not about politics. In Britain, there's a climate change group that is non-partisan, that vets policy in relation to whether it's good or not for climate change. And sure, they're not brilliant, but they're doing a damn sight better than we are in Canada. Absolutely. And we need to do that. There's no reason why we couldn't do that, and we just have to demand it. So that's my words.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Can I add to that? I think, you know, these phenomena that are happening, climate change and COVID-19, two notable ones, they're actually incentives, if you think of them in a different way. They are catalyzing people to think differently and to take some action. So yeah, they are, especially climate change, of course, they're affecting our well-being, affecting the well-being of the forests, but they are also putting a fire under us to do something. The second point I might make is that hydrologically, there's quite a bit of resilience in the system. You know, if we could just go light on the forests for a while, a lot of recovery would happen hydrologically. And we can also go in like we did in the forest renewal program in the 90s and improve some of the drainage systems, remove some of the worst problems of the roads. So we could actually improve things fairly quickly with a concerted effort. So I guess resilience and recovery are there. Examples are also there. There are just two community forests that come to mind just locally where I live, Herrick Proctor and Creston. And they both do so-called alternative systems, you know, partial cuts and small patch cuts, etc., narrow roads, ways to build resilience hydrologically into the system. We have remnants of old growth and primary and other primary forests that we could protect. Those are available to us. So just on the hope side of the ledger, there are some real reasons to not give up the hope for the future. And even politically, we do have the Professional Governance Act, PGA. It's just about to get into full implementation, I believe, in November. And there's some hope there that that will open up some of the privatization and the narrow management that has been able to entrench current systems. I'll stop there. Yeah, there's reasons for hope.
Thanks, Martin. So, Rachel, one of the things that I'm asking a number of our guests is, in order to inspire and motivate citizens and groups and individuals and communities, can you think of an example of someone in a community or someone that you've seen, it doesn't necessarily have to be BC, who's doing it, who's picked up the baton and is making something happen in their community or on a larger scale?
I don't think it's about big things. I think there's a lot of people, and I'm not good at naming names, but there's a lot of people who are standing up. So, you know, I would think of Michelle Connolly in Conservation North, for instance, is making real change. I think there's a large number of people who very genuinely are deeply concerned, who are concerned about First Nations, who are concerned about First Nations being pulled along and pushed into the same capitalist model that we're just working through now. There's a lot of people who are trying to balance all these very complicated things. Yeah, I don't really have excellent particular names. I think it's up to everyone. I really do. I think it's up to school teachers and nurses and policemen and everybody. It's not about the environmentalists. We need to drop the term. Like, we all drink the water, and whether we eat the fish or not, we want them to be out there. Like, there are cold water species. We won't have salmon in BC in a very short moment. Like, people are so unaware of the real details, but they have an underlying unease, and it's about everybody.
Jens, I'm going to go to you, and can you tell me what you think are the possibilities and potential and the solutions that we should be moving towards?
Thank you, first of all, for bringing these perspectives together. It was a little bit of a sobering experience to hear about the full range on the state of the old growth, hydrology, wildlife, and climate change. One reason why I'm not giving up hope is that nature is very resilient, and we see examples over and over again. Martin talked a little bit about how these environmental services still exist even when ecosystems are damaged. And looking at climate change and carbon, the fact that BC's forests have lost so much carbon also means that if we get really serious about restoring ecosystems, many of these ecosystems could in fact recapture a lot of the carbon that was previously stored in these ecosystems. So we're clearly running out of time, because as the planet is warming up, we will see more damages. But if we get serious today, we can restore forests. We have some of the most productive forests on the planet in this part of the world, and we could really see a big difference in terms of what's happening to carbon in our forests. And the other reason why I'm hopeful is the wisdom of indigenous peoples. So we see a number of examples in many different territories across the province where nations show leadership, from Clackwood Sound to the Great Bear Rainforest to some nations in the interior of the province, that are really seeking solutions for new land use designations, indigenous protected areas, for example. And as Rachel alluded to, we absolutely need pressure on governments to support them. So right now, many indigenous nations have support when they want to go along with the program. If they agree with logging, the BC government will support them in some form, to some degree. Many logging companies do the same, obviously, but we are not seeing the same willingness to support nations that actually want something different. There are opportunities from the federal government to support nations that want to protect more of their land with conservation financing. We need to see the same leadership from the BC government. So in short, time is running out. We have lots of opportunities to restore ecosystems, protect what remains intact, working with indigenous governments, but we have to do it today, not tomorrow. Thank you.
I would just echo what Rachel said, is people need to start using their own voice and let it be known that they're very concerned and they want some changes. Every voice matters. And in fact, people who open their mouths and also write things down, it's a very big multiplier of one, because not many people do it. So it has a great effect. And I think any people listening, just do something, speak to someone.
So we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much to all of the guests today for bringing together these threads that seem like they're disconnected, and showing us how they're all related to each other. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you, Jennifer, for organizing this. I think it's really good.
Thank you, Martin.
And thank you. Yeah, it was great to be part of this.
And thanks very much, Jens.
Thanks, and thanks to all our supporters and everyone who's listening today. And please join the Forest March and keep up the pressure for a different future for BC's forests.
Beauty, and thanks very much, Dan. Bye, everybody.